Hello, my name is Anna Błasiak,
And my name is Rosie Goldsmith.
and we are the hosts of the Polka podcast on Polish books in English.
Every 2 months, we'll be bringing you topical news, views, and interviews and sharing our excitement over this new golden age of Polish literature in translation.
The Polka podcast is produced by the European Literature Network in collaboration with the Polish Cultural Institute in London.
It's available for free on all your favorite podcast platforms.
Welcome to the Polka podcast. In this episode, we will be focusing on poetry and poets coming from Poland. The reason for this, or an excuse if you prefer, is the European Poetry Festival, which takes place in London across different venues. The European Poetry Festival is now in its 9th year. It celebrates collaboration, literary liveness, and cross-linguistic inventiveness. Over 100 poets participate this year, many visiting from across Europe, including Cyprus, Switzerland, Estonia, Austria, Latvia, Norway, Flanders, and, for the first time ever, Poland. The Polish evening features Polish poets both residing and writing in the UK and those visiting from Poland. They present brand new literary works and performance collaborations, all created especially for the night. The evening features Weronika Lewandowska and Misha Poole, Agata Masłowska and Agnieszka Studzińska, Maria Jastrzębska and Jules Sprake, myself and Susie Campbell, Tomasz Mielcarek and Michael Bach, Nasim Łuczaj and Hannah Kaib, Landa Wu and James Byrne, and Magda Drozd and S.J. Fowler. Before we let you listen to some of the festival readings, we would like to talk more widely about Polish poetry and poets. Our guest today is Piotr Florczyk. Piotr is an award-winning poet, scholar, essayist, and translator. He was born and raised in Kraków in Poland and has lived in the United States since 1994. He teaches global literary studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. He published 11 volumes of his own poetry in Polish and in English, as well as 15 translations of poetry, mainly from Polish into English, but there is also one that he has translated the other way round. In addition to his books, he has published essays and reviews in many journals, including The New Yorker, Times Literary Supplement, and World Literature Today. He is one of the founders of Calypso Editions, a cooperative press, and former translations editor for the Los Angeles Review. His latest publishing project, Text Shop Editions, is dedicated to publishing short experimental works. Piotr and his wife Dina, who met as competitive swimmers, live with their children in Los Angeles. He joined us today from there. Piotr, welcome to the Polka podcast, and thank you for finding time to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me, Anka. Happy to be here.
So, how's poetry doing now in Poland? A lot of English language readers would have heard about Miłosz, Szymborska, Zagajewski, Herbert. They are the giants of the 20th century Polish poetry. But what about newer names?
What a great question. Right off the bat, what's happening in Polish poetry? Well, you have mentioned the classic names of Polish letters, not just Polish poetry, Miłosz, Herbert, Szymborska, etc. And what's interesting, and I think the first thing to say is to point out that someone like Wisława Szymborska is still very much present on this scene, even though she's been, of course, dead for a long time now. The fact that her foundation, the Wisława Szymborska Foundation, is such a robust entity, very much present on the Polish scene, that enables and ensures that her poetry continues to be read, continues to be translated, continues to influence, I think, younger Polish poets, and including some older ones. You know, for instance, you have given that wonderful extended bio of mine, so our listeners know that I am based in the States. And let me just say that Wisława Szymborska, in my view, happens to be the most popular Polish poet in English translation. I don't know if that's the case in the UK as well, but it very much is in the States. In terms of younger Polish poets or the Polish poetry scene in general, I think it is very robust. It's very democratic in terms of poets coming up through the ranks, not just from, the handful of Poland's largest cities like Kraków or Warsaw, Wrocław, but smaller cities and smaller literary centers, regions, etc. Someone like Justyna Kulikowska, for instance, whose poetry you have translated, if I'm not mistaken, who is originally and might still be based in northeastern part of Poland, which is to say, not someone who, was born or went to school in, again, Warsaw, Kraków, Wrocław, Gdańsk, etc. So there are lots of really good younger Polish poets, and I think we should clarify what we mean by that because being based in the States, I often have to explain what that means. And as you yourself know, a lot of Polish poets tend to debut at a really young age, which is very different from for instance, from what we have in the States, where the average age for an American poet to publish their first book of poems is something like 35. In Poland, you remember someone like Tadeusz Dąbrowski. Tadeusz Dąbrowski, poet from Gdańsk, born in 1979. I will never forget. It wasn't dismay, but it was just a kind of a puzzled look that I got from my friends when 20 years ago I had mentioned how Tadeusz Dąbrowski, who was then in his mid 20s, that he had published 5 books of poems, and people were like, "What? He's 25 and he published 5 books of poems?" So I think that's really important to keep in mind that when we say younger Polish poets, we really mean, people who are 30 or younger, and have published more than one, sometimes more than 2 books of poems. So there's a lot to be said about not just the poets who are coming up through the ranks and publishing a lot, but also how the Polish literary community and the Polish literary scene makes it possible for people to publish their first books at a really young age. So again, very robust, lots of new voices. Because again of that ease of publishing, there's so many new voices every single year.
I wanted to add a bit about Szymborska because you asked about her importance and her relevance today in this country, in the UK. So, as a footnote, there is a new Szymborska collection coming out in July this year here in Britain called The Acrobat. So, yes, it is very much relevant and still clearly published and read quite widely. Faber and Faber. You, if I counted correctly, have translated 10 Polish poets into English. They belong to different generations, they write in different styles. How did you make those choices? What made you decide to translate them? Tell us a bit about those poets.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thanks for asking, because this is something I actually like talking about. It says a lot about how I see my work as a translator. So yes, 10 poets. Again, I will take your word for it. Different generations, someone like Anna Świrszczyńska, aka Anna Swir, Julian Kornhauser, right? A new wave poet born in 1946. Couple poets born in the 1960s, poets born in the 1970s. Why these voices? Why these poets and not somebody else? I have always treated my work as a translator as an extension of my work as a poet slash writer, which is to say, I wanted to learn how to write by way of translating these and not other poets. So typically, what I would do is I would seek out a poet whose work differed from my work in some way. It could be form wise, it could be formally. And the idea was that by translating their work into English, I would be able to then expand my poetic toolkit and again expand my repertoire as a poet and as a writer. And so I think that's really important in general, right? We often talk about young poets or emerging poets being able to write in one or two different styles, right? Everybody has their own kind of inherent way of formulating images, articulating things. And as someone who teaches creative writing, I think it's really important to push people in different directions, right? So for me, translation was my own way of pushing myself into different, again, poetic styles, techniques, and whatnot. Now, having said that, I should also add that some of the poets whose work I've translated, they kind of embodied my idea of also expanding the poetic canon a little bit, right? So Julian Kornhauser, for instance, in addition to again learning from his work, I also wanted to introduce to English language readers someone who excuse me, a contemporary of Adam Zagajewski's, right? So Julian Kornhauser and Adam Zagajewski were at one point in their lives very, very close. They had co-authored a manifesto in the 1960s that became really popular and very seminal in terms of its reach and influence. For many, many years, everybody knew Adam's work in English, right? Because it had been translated for a number of years, but very few people knew that, hey, this whole new wave school of poets, so to speak, new wave, right? So to speak, school, because many people who are grouped into a particular movement or school, of course, will kind of reject that idea, right? They say, well, we're never a school or a movement. We're just, contemporaries in terms of our age, and we happen to be writing and publishing at the same time. But again, Adam as the kind of representative Polish poet born in the mid 1940s, the new wave movement that became really popular and came onto the scene in the mid to late 1960s. And I thought, hey, there are lots of other voices who are part of that movement as well. So why not Julian Kornhauser? And of course, we can spend hours talking about how and why certain poets become famous and read, and of course, by extension, translated. But again, that would be the example of Julian Kornhauser. And then some of the younger poets whose work I've translated are my contemporaries, poets born in the mid to late 1970s. So felt it would be natural for me to see what, people in Poland are writing, people who are roughly my age. I have tried very hard over the years not to accept any commissions. So 99% of the works I've translated are works that I had set out myself for one reason or another, rather than somebody coming to me and saying, hey, we would love to have so and so's work be available in English. Would you translate that for us? So that's another thing that I have been able to remain committed to.
You mentioned different poetic styles. Can you give us some examples of the poets that you have translated over the years?
Yeah. So Anna Świrszczyńska, for instance, aka Anna Swir, I was talking about commissions. That is the only book that came to me by way of a commission, by way of a publisher approaching me about bringing back her volume, Building the Barricade.
And am I correct in thinking that there were 3 separate editions of this book that you're talking about, of Building the Barricade?
Well, there had been an edition done in the 1980s, I believe, or maybe 1990s. I can't remember anymore. That had long been out of print. And so when Calypso Editions, the small press that you mentioned at the very beginning, when we found it, my friends and I, when we started the press, that was our first book. That was our
Mhm.
first book. And what it was not the entire volume, because the book itself has more than 100 poems in it. So to get Calypso Editions off the ground, we thought, why don't we do a small selection of those poems? Plus a handful of poems from Świrszczyńska's other volumes. And so the book that came out in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, it's a chapbook sized book, or a pamphlet, as you would say in the UK, right? It's a book that has 24, maybe 25 poems in it
Mhm.
only. But because of that publication, then I started getting emails from other publishers who said, "Oh, it's great to have, new stuff by Świrszczyńska or Anna Swir, as she's known in the States or in English. How about the whole volume? How about you do the whole volume for us? The whole Building the Barricade, seminal Poetry of Witness, Warsaw Uprising collection." My initial reaction was, no thanks. I'm not interested. I don't want to spend 6 months thinking about the Warsaw Uprising and, thinking about the war, et cetera, et cetera. But eventually, long story short, eventually I came around and I said, okay, I'm going to do it for you guys. And the press was called Tavern Books. It's a wonderful, wonderful small press based in Portland, Oregon that only did translations. And I said, okay, I know you guys can do a great job in terms of, the book itself as a physical object, that it would be beautifully published. They wanted to do both a hardback and a paperback edition, which really sounded wonderful to me. And so, yeah, ultimately I acquiesced, if you will, and I did that whole thing for them. And that is a really good example of a book that pretty much all of the poems in that book are really short. They're very spare. One really has to read between the lines in terms of what Świrszczyńska perhaps did not want to say or include. It's a book that treats a subject that's very problematic for a lot of Poles, even today, right? The 1944 Warsaw Uprising. First of all, she had taken more than 30 years to write that book, right? So that book did not come out till the mid to late 1970s in Poland. So it had taken Świrszczyńska a long time to find the idiom, find the language to speak of her own experience as a military nurse during the Warsaw Uprising. The poems are brilliant because they are stripped of any pathos. I mean, there are just like bare bones, surgically precise, and very much image driven. And I have always been attracted to that kind of poetry because I like poems that are not overwritten. I like poems that are not narrative to the point where one really can't tell why is this a poem and not prose, right? Why is this written in a kind of a traditional stanzaic form as opposed to something that would resemble a standard prose paragraph, right? And when you look at those poems from Building the Barricade, at times when I was translating those poems, I really had to refrain from trying to overwrite certain images, to pad them even more, or to explain, to over articulate some of the images that seem really flat to some extent. So that would be a really good example of learning how to do that, right? Learning how to refrain from overwriting a poem or just overwriting in general, right? Like, here are the images, play with it. This is all I can give you. I don't have to explain. I don't have to fill in the blanks. And if I may bring up a contemporary poet who's really good at doing the same thing, is a poet named Joanna Bociąg. Joanna Bociąg has published 2 books of poems. She was born in 1989, if I'm not mistaken, in the city of Poznań. That's where she's from. She lives in Kraków, where it so happens that she works for the Wisława Szymborska Foundation. But her poems are very spare, just like that. They're like sketched out poems, a few lines, a few images. Sometimes you're actually not really certain what to do with it. The poem kind of starts and then it almost ends immediately right after. And part of you wants to see more, right? Wants more lines, wants the poem to continue. Again, wants the narrative that is just merely sketched out to kind of continue. But of course, if we got that, that would have been a completely different type of poem, right? And poetry. So I really love Joanna Bociąg's work and the fact that and I can only speculate, that's her MO as a poet, right? I am not going to overwrite. I'm not going to give you pretty poems that seem complete and well-rounded and have a clearly defined beginning, middle, and end. No, this is just like the scrap of language I'm giving you, and let's see what you do with that. I love that. I love that because in my view, that kind of poetry does not write itself into any kind of attempt at being liked, right? Or having a kind of a reciprocal relationship with the audience, right? Clearly, Anna Bociąg is not interested in that.
Will you read us an example of her writing, please?
I would be happy to. So again, she's done 2 books. Her second collection came out this past spring, but this is from her first book, and it goes like this. For a while. For a while, after my dad moved out, we would meet up in small art house theaters until he started a new family. See what I mean?
Yes.
See what I mean? Part of you says, and? And then what happened, right? And what do we learn about the relationship between the speaker and the father figure in this poem? I would just love to see Joanna's drafts. I would just love to be the fly on the wall in her study. Oh, did she write a whole page and then she extracted, just these lines out of that entire page and said, no, this is the poem, right? This is the heartbeat of the poem. And I'm just going to give you this. I'm not going to give you anything else. Let me give you one more. Monica 1. She shares a picture of her daughter with a broken nose. Tomorrow I'll say she's pretty. I know you can't see the poem. It's 2 couplets. The title plus 2 couplets, that's all it is. No punctuation. The entire thing is lowercase. Brilliant.
Quite a skill to distill it so far.
To distill it, yes, but also to refrain from wanting to continue, right? Wanting to go on and to trust oneself that this is it, right? This is okay. And to have also perhaps the trust in the reader, right? A poem like this will elicit a reaction from the reader, a reaction that actually, might be more pronounced and more profound than as if the poem had been overwritten or much longer and more complete in terms of the narrative arc of it.
What about some of your other authors? Give us some examples and talk us through them.
I'm going to read a poem by Maciej Robert. Maciej Robert is a contemporary Polish poet, essayist, publisher, editor. He lives in the city of Łódź, where he directs the literature house there. And this poem is from a collection that I am putting final touches on. It is under contract with an American press called Y Pine Press. And we're hoping that the book will be published next spring. And this one is called The End of Language. I am not entirely sure what brought me here. Language? The tip of my tongue for a guide, perhaps? The sour musk of a terrified animal under the overpass? A pile of bones, a scrap of skin with a tuft of fur. This man was here first. I dust myself off the dirt, stand up, and ask about the way, even though I know it well. Maciej Robert. Mold. This house is haunted. Something rustles in the attic. You can't find the things left on the table yesterday. The lights come on by themselves and then go out inside us. This war, declared in good faith against each other, is doomed to failure. We raise the white flag, watch it turn gray.
So tell me, how do poets like this, I'm particularly interested in Joanna Bociąg, how do they function in the English-speaking world with this unapologetic briefness and not holding the reader by the hand? And also, generally, how does the contemporary Polish poetry scene compare to American one, for example?
I think I heard 5 different questions in there, but let me do my best. Let me do my best. So, one thing that I do want to address, which you alluded to, is how does this kind of work, Joanna Bociąg's work? How would it, right? How might it function, exist within English language poetry, particularly in the States? So the poems I have shared have not been published yet. This is from a work in progress. But the point you're raising is actually really, really important. And it's been on my mind for a long time because part of me worries that Joanna's work will have a really hard time within the Anglo-American sphere because by and large, I would say, and I hate to generalize, and I don't think it's healthy to do that, but wouldn't you agree that most contemporary poetry tends to be narrative driven, right? We again begin in one place, then we travel with the poet or with the speaker. There may or may not be characters, of course, but there is a story, if you will, right? A tale that the poet is telling.
I think that's especially the case with English language poetry, both
Yeah,
American and British, to a point.
yeah. And so Joanna's work, which is again very taciturn, very laconic, may have a hard time finding its readers. But this also reminds me of another reason why I translate and how I see translation operating within its target language, community, sphere, what have you, which is that I tend to translate works that I think might appeal to American poets or English language poets. So I've never been interested in being what Jerzy Jarniewicz, Polish poet, critic, scholar, theorist of translation, has referred to as a translator as ambassador, right? Translator who translates the classics of the source language, literary tradition, the canon, because they believe that the world would be a better place if they knew what Polish school kids have to study or something like that. In fact, it's always been the opposite for me. And so Jarniewicz also comes up with the label of the translator as legislator. Translator as legislator is the one who aims to influence, to penetrate the target language community, literary scene, etc. Maybe this is the thing that drives me to translate someone like Joanna Bociąg's work, right? Because it's so different, seemingly at least, so different from majority of contemporary American poetry that that is precisely the reason, to bring something that's different into that conversation that is ongoing on daily basis in the States or in the UK. Like, hey, look, we all like narrative poems, right? I myself included. But look, there's this Polish poet who eschews narrative, who does away with the narrative. And what do we think about that? What do we think about these scraps of poems, if you will, right? I mean, this isn't to say that British or American poets do not write really short or spare poems. Some of them, in fact, do. But I think Joanna Bociąg takes that spareness to an extreme. I think it's just bits and pieces of something that can blossom into a narrative, but only in the reader's mind, right? In that sense, it's a kind of a co-creative process. Here's what I give you. I give you these few lines and invite you, the reader, to make what you will of it, but I hope you will spend time with it, right? And again, the reader gets to then create their own additional lines or to think how the white space around those few lines that Joanna gives us, how that white space coexists with the language. What pressures, if any, does the white space enact on the language that is written down, right? That does appear on the page.
How does the contemporary Polish poetry scene compare to American one generally? I mean, you've already pointed out a few differences.
Here's what I have observed over the last 10 years or so. We have lived and experienced and been reading and publishing works in which sincerity, the idea of sincerity, is front and center. So, this idea of the opposite of which would be, say, poems that are language driven, poems in which the poet does something interesting, unique with language. I think those types of poems have been sidelined again in favor of poems that bear it all, if you will, right? People want to read stories, tales that seemed honest and truthful, where the poet is not hiding behind formalist, modernist facades, where the readers, particularly younger readers, I think, they want to equate the poet with the speaker, right? They really want to get to know the person speaking to them through the poems. They also want to be able to identify with whatever that poem happens to be about. Whereas, of course, people who are critics, poets, readers who think of language as the most important thing in a poem would have a really hard time with that. That a poem, according to some of these younger readers, if you will, that there would be a definitive reading of a poem. And maybe I'm dating myself a little bit here, but when I was coming up as a poet, as a writer, that idea of sincerity, speaking to the audiences, in a very straight, direct, unadorned way, that was like a big no-no. I mean, nobody does that. Poetry, it's like this elevated language, and the formalist aspect of it was very, very important back in those days. I don't think that's the case anymore. So again, American poetry, very much, this is who I am. These are the times that we happen to be living through and in, and I'm going to speak about those things in the most direct, even journalistic way I can. And I think younger Polish poetry does the same thing. I think younger Polish poets are very much politically engaged. They really take the idea of speaking truth to power seriously. Do they bear it all? Yeah, in many cases they do. Do they have a problem with older poets hiding behind, again, formalist tricks, facades? I don't know. We would have to ask them about that.
Piotr, you are a poet yourself. Your first book was in Polish, but then you published several volumes in English. And more recently, you've been kind of switching back and forth between your two languages. How does that happen? And do you ever write in both languages at the same time? Do you write bilingually? That's my personal favorite question to ask everybody who I can ask this question. So there you go. Please tell me.
Well, thank you. And of course, we should say, if somebody is not in on it, you yourself are an accomplished, award-winning translator and writer, right? Both in Polish and in English. So I think I know where this question is coming from. The best way to answer it is that I have always tried to keep my two languages separate. And I could go on for a really long time telling you why, but I will just say that migrant writers who are bilingual, translingual, exophonic writers, right, as we would call them in our kind of a scholarly little, ivory towers. I think many of those writers, when they begin to play with their languages, plural languages, I think they tend to be confused as to where they belong, right? Do they belong, in my case or your case, do we belong in the American or the British tradition? Do we belong in the Polish tradition from which we come from, right? And how do those two communities feel about us? I think is also a question that I've been asking myself. When I first started writing creatively, I did it for self-preservation. I really wanted my first language, Polish, I wanted to retain that language. I wanted to stay in touch with it, if you will, because I moved to the States in 1994. That was pretty much, pre-internet days. I really felt cut off from all things Poland, and Polish. And so when I started writing creatively, this was much later. This was when I was in college. I really had felt I was losing my Polish, my first language. And so I thought, why don't I start writing poems in that language? And I thought this idea of using the language creatively would be very beneficial to keeping it fresh and watered as if it were a plant, which in some ways it is, right? A language is a living thing, right?
Love this metaphor.
Yeah, and so I wanted to kind of keep tending to it. But eventually, the battle between my first and my second language, or my acquired language, the second language won out, because after doing that for a couple years, I had realized that this was just silly. I was not going back to Poland. I was going to stay here in the States and try to have a life here. And so I might as well write in the language that I was immersed in. So I switched to writing in English exclusively. And I had a really great time with it. It felt liberating to do that. That's when I also started translating, right? The idea of mastering the language by way of using it as a translator, became really important to me. But you're right. Eventually, I went back, or reconnected, if you will, with my first language.
One last question, and I'm going to take you back to your translator role. Who do you have on your radar now, and who are the poets to look out for? And also, what new translations are you working on? You've mentioned some names already. You've mentioned Joanna Bociąg and Maciej Robert. Anybody else that you're working on now?
Yeah, so I am working on co-translations with my wonderful friend Alice Catherine Carls, who's based in Tennessee. She and I have been translating the work of Krzysztof Siwczyk, poet, essayist, critic, born in 1977, the same year that Maciej Robert was born. Wonderful writer. So we, Catherine and I, published a selected volume of Krzysztof's poems a couple years ago, and now we're working on a collection of his essays that should be published. I hope, like with Maciej Robert's work, next spring. Joanna Bociąg, whose couple poems I've shared. Then there's Antonina Tosiek. Antonina Tosiek, wonderful, wonderful poet, essayist, scholar, based in Poznań, the winner of last year's Wisława Szymborska Poetry Prize for her second book of poems. I've been translating very slowly, but nevertheless been at it for a number of months now. Her poems, hoping to put together a small selected volume at some point. And then there are a couple other names that, for now I'll just keep to myself.
Piotr, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion on Polish poetry as it is now, and for finding time for the Polka podcast.
That was a truly wonderful interview, Anna. I loved hearing both of you and Piotr Florczyk, chatting about translation and poetry. And I honestly learned so much. As you know, poetry is not my specialism, but yours. And I'm taking a back seat very deliberately on this episode of the Polka podcast. But that doesn't stop me admiring poetry and Polish poetry enormously, and reading it and hearing it performed.
So, Rosie, when did you start reading Polish poetry?
Well, not as a child, as you probably did, but I date it back to reading Czesław Miłosz's new and collected poems, which was about 15 years ago, and it came out in a Penguin Classic edition. Now, I was so excited by reading it that I organised a flash poetry event on the piazza or courtyard outside the British Library in London. It was an amazing event. But as far as contemporary poets, Anna, I really have you to thank for introducing me to Polish poetry and Polish poetry and translation through your Polka blog and the Poetry Travels blog on the website of the European Literature Network. But also thanks to your own bilingual publications over the years. Now, I am a massive admirer, I say it now out and loud, of your poetry and translations. So, Anna, when did you start writing poetry, not just reading it as I do, and why did you?
It happened quite organically, as it often does. I started writing as a teenager. I was looking for a way to express myself. I was always an avid reader also of poetry and found a lot of inspiration there. And I soon started experimenting with form and with language. And like Piotr Florczyk said in the interview, one learns a lot from other poets. You can't write without reading. But it took me a long time before I started publishing.
How do you feel about bilingual poetry? Because this is one of your hallmarks, Polish and English writing.
Well, my first book came out in 2020. It was called, watch it, it's one of the longest titles in the history of literature, Cafe by Ransom James in the Fields, Lunchtime. And that book was bilingual, but all of the poems in that volume were written in Polish and then translated into English, not by me, but by four wonderful translators who are also good friends. But I have also been experimenting with English in my writing, and I have been doing it for years. So when it came to my second book in 2024, and the book is called Deliverance, Rozpętanie, I tried to show the tension between my two languages. I tried to show what goes on in my head. So some poems are simply separated into two language versions, but several of them mix up the languages. The two languages push, pull, and fight with each other. And I let this process lead me. I do think that the tension it creates can be very interesting and can be used as a creative tool. And that's what I try to do.
Definitely works. I mean, it's a fascinating process. Now, you've done something new, very big and very new. Nothing ever stops you moving forward, I know. But tell us about your new publishing venture, Sideways. Is it just poetry?
Sideways Press is a tiny, teeny publishing house. It's all very new, and I'm still in the process of developing it. If I were to define what I want to publish, it will be mainly poetry, mainly in translation, mainly from Polish. And yes, our first publication ticks those boxes. It's a long poem called Psalm to Saint Sabina by a Polish poet called Radosław Wiśniewski, which I have translated from Polish into English.
Now, I'm going to ask you to read a little bit of that poem because I know that you've escaped so far. You participated in the European Poetry Festival, and we're not going to be able to hear your reading from there. But now I really would love to hear something from you. So go ahead.
Psalm to Saint Sabina by Radosław Wiśniewski. Saint Sabina of Brzeg, Kołomyja, Śniatyń, Łapy, Tobolsk, whose ID said your place of birth was Śniatyn in the USSR, even though when you were born, there was no USSR, and the ruler was Tsar Nicholas, a saint by definition. You who led us all before we even happened along, hidden in the twists of the steppe genotype, out of your home towards your captivity in June 1941, with 1 hour left to pack anything. In your person, our history is stitched together with a tug of rail tracks, in a steady ratat of the wheels of cattle wagons as far as Orsha, to the bridge over the Dnieper River, where they stopped, abandoned by the guards. And suddenly, Stukas dropped bombs from the sky, and the wagons were full of people, and the wagon doors were sealed.
Fantastic. And some really memorable lines in that, too. When did you first read that poem and what struck you about it?
I remember reading this poem in Polish years ago, probably about 15 years ago, and I was absolutely fascinated by how you can tell a story in a poem form and keep that narrative line, but at the same time play with the form and the language. So all of that comes together in this long poem.
Well, I can't recommend it highly enough because I have the book, as you know, and also best of luck with the new publishing house. I'm sure it'll
Thank
be a
you.
great success. Look forward to all the forthcoming books, and I'm sure we'll talk about those in the Polka podcast over the next few months and years and however long we continue. Now, as you mentioned, Anna, at the start of this episode of the Polka podcast, we said we were going to hear some tasters from this summer's European Poetry Festival. Now, remind us about the festival, where it takes place. Is it in front of a live audience? How long does it go on for? And then tell us about the Polish poetry performances you've selected for the podcast and why you chose them. So go for it.
So, European Poetry Festival takes place across many different venues in London and sometimes outside of London as well. These are always live events with live audiences, which you can hear in our recordings. All poets work and perform in pairs. How it works is Polish poets, in this case, in case of this particular event, are paired with British poets and they work together on a collaborative piece, which then they perform during the live event. So the first pair you're going to hear is Agata Masłowska and Agnieszka Studzińska, who focused on the Polish textile artist Magdalena Abakanowicz.
What is happening when I'm weaving a forest and unable to put it into words? Cocooned in wool, thread nestling between body and your desire. You say we are all fibrous structures. I'm making a wish. Can you hear it? In the sinuous folds of material I feel unborn. Tell me how to be when I'm no longer the woman I have knitted for myself, when the stitch that links this unpicky of a landscape hangs loose like a wish upon a wish. Perhaps I am a leaf unfolding from a seashell. I bloom when touched. I unravel when ignored. I know I am larger than life. Thread upon thread, echoes through the forest, woven sprouting joy and knotted silence. There is a vibration in the forest floor. I put my ear to it. Którędy płynie rzeka? Słyszę jej szepty. Where does the river flow? I hear its whispers or other people's words skimming across it, and the sunshine spitting the syllables into falling leaves. Things are falling, and the woven surface of the woven object ripples in a fibrous forest. Someone speaks. I'm interested in every tangle of thread and rope and every possibility of transformation. Zwięzłe więzy, knotted leaves, silence searching for space. Otwieram korę drzewa through the light. Cienka nić of a spider's web. Łapię się na tym, że brakuje mi słowa. O co mi chodzi? I catch my toe on the line. I shake like a leaf. Ask me how I got here. And you got here, and you opened the tree bark, and you found the right word, and found yourself. Voice as a garment. Wear my voice, jak sukienkę, woven on a large loom. It is a feminized work, easily thrown away, trudna w kompozycji. What is happening when I'm weaving a forest and unable to put it into words? Perhaps I am a leaf, cocooned in wool, unfolding, threads nestling between body and your desire from a seashell. You say we are all fibrous structures. I bloom when touched. I'm making a wish. Shh. I unravel when ignored. I know I am larger than life. In the sinuous folds of material, thread upon thread, tell me how to be. There is vibration in forest floor. When I'm no longer the woman I littered for myself, I put my ear to it. When the stitch that links this unpicking of the landscape, którędy płynie rzeka, hangs loose like a wish upon a wish. Słyszę jej szepty. Perhaps I'm a leaf. Where does the river flow? Unfolding. I hear its whispers from a seed shell. Słyszę jej szepty. I bloom when touched. Szepty. I know I'm not lying. Thread and thread.
This was Agata Masłowska and Agnieszka Studzińska performing their piece at the European Poetry Festival in 100 Years Gallery in London. The second duo is Maria Jastrzębska and Jules Sprake, who wrote and performed a poem about Sappho.
Age is just a number, right? But when I tell people I'm 2,654 years old, 2,656, well, okay, maybe 2,656, according to how you do the calculation. Anyway, they look at me strangely. So, am I still in or am I out? Here, in what used to be called Café Largactyl. Café Wisława Szymborska now. It's what we say to cats. In or out. Oh, make up your furry mind. You do know I invented the lavender thing. You do know I invented the lavender thing? Nosegays of lavender cluster. Long time scent lost. Forgotten tokens. Sleep-inducing larvae will breed on, regardless of the camphor that was. Those Boston boys owe their lavender rhinoceros to me, parading a huge papier-mâché rhino, much maligned and misunderstood. Indeed. Does anyone thank me? Treat me to a coffee? I know a woman who still wears a labris. Am I supposed to dangle a carabiner from my belt, wear breeches to make myself recognizable? Am I supposed to drape my shoulders in a linen chiton, wear beads to perform, to hover, to sway, to circle, to perform, well, myself? Safona, jasne. People don't believe me when I say who I am. There's my age, 2,656. They balk at that. It's like I'm expected to be more me. Is lavender still relevant? Do you long to fit in? Or do you want to stand out? Do you long to fit in or do you want to stand out? Clenched in pockets, tiny fists don't want you to notice me. Glances that double take a look in my direction, or even worse, you don't belong here. Self-preservation is messy, unblendable. So right now, I am designed to be whatever you need me to be. Poised, stock still, in a game of statues. Sometimes I want to disappear, walk away, dissolving into rain and mist like a creature of the night, a moth no one can see by day, grey or brown like the colour of bark, the colour of an antenna, of crumbling walls. Give me the quiet of shadows. Do you know how many people Google, is it okay to sleep in a room with a moth? Is it okay to sleep in a room with a moth? So, they applied vapor rub to keep breathing overnight, but in the dark still cling to the bedsheet. A white-knuckled moth shivers, anticipating first flight. Is there an echo in this place? What do I know? I don't know anything, but I know a lot. Do you want to wave a flag or tear it up? Do you want to wave a flag or tear it up? They're buzzing about a statue of a man blinded by a flag he is carrying, a reminder of toppled giants. Plinth, this man marches between other static heroes of civic pride. Unsighted, I stick to the sole of his shoe, stepping off ledge. His nose is a fold in the flag. Did you hear that? Or is it just me? Did you hear that? The buzzing statue is cast in fiberglass resin. Hollow sounding. We gather inside this marching man. Tiny wings warming up, spinning cocoons. His flag starts to swarm. I unclench my fists and make my move. Are you recording this? We didn't record anything back then. I didn't even write it down. I just sang what I wanted to say. Sing. Just sang. Sing, 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 sing. Don't get me wrong. Obviously, I want recognition, crave attention. Well, no one wants to be overlooked, and I certainly don't want to be erased. I had enough of that. Has that happened to you? I had centuries of it, glossing over euphemism, omission, outright lies. It gets you down. So what are you? Social butterfly or stealthy moth? So what earth? So what are you? I'm stealthy, a white-knuckled moth. Yati, pola Stefania, apo violetes, que roda, e crocus, e vasas diplamo, que poles plegmenes irlandes, giro, ston apologa, sulemor, stolises meludia. The many crowns of violets and roses at my side you put on, and many woven garlands made of flowers around your soft neck. Around your soft neck? Ah, terribly. What is that sound? Is it AI? Or is it a real person? Whose voice is that? I do remember things very clearly despite my age. Whose voice is that? Unsighted, I stick, spinning cocoons. I remember each of my lovers. There's been a few. Their scents, our love-making. Lubiłaś ozdabiać włosy świeżymi kwiatami wianków i fiołków i róż. Nieraz młodzieńczą szyję wdzięcznie przystrajałaś splotami papnących kwiatów. Oh, those soft pillows. Diadems, crowns, woven or twisted garlands, tender or slender neck. All those interpretations. I don't mind. There's always complaints about fragments. I sang and people remembered fragments. Of the world, I've known only fragments that are left. I rejoice in each one. I used to be so certain, but with each day, I have more questions buzzing round like bees in lavender. This one. Wisdom, priesthood. Wisdom, priesthood. Wisdom, priesthood. This one. This one. This one. This one.
Thank you to the poets Agata Masłowska, Agnieszka Studzińska, Maria Jastrzębska, and Jules Sprake, as well as the curator of the European Poetry Festival, Stephen J. Fowler. But first and foremost, thank you to Piotr Florczyk for the conversation on where Polish poetry is now.
And thank you, Anna, so much. I've really enjoyed sitting back and listening to you and your insights into Polish poetry and translation. Now, we hope you've all enjoyed this Polka podcast.
You can find more information about the festival, poets, and books we've been discussing under the heading The Polka Podcast on our websites. That is eurolitnetwork.com and instytutpolski.pl.
So make a date with the Polka Podcast every 2 months. We'll be bringing you the best of Polish writing in English, the prose, poetry, non-fiction, reportage, children's literature, and graphic novels. All those Polish books you need to know, as well as those Polish books we hope will be translated one day into English.
Join us again, same time, same place, for our next episode when we focus on children's literature from Poland.
Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye for now from me, Rosie Goldsmith.
And from me, Anna Błasiak.